I want to welcome everybody to the Raleigh Developer User Group. For those of you, this is your first time, welcome. Glad to have you here. We're going to hopefully have one more virtual session coming up in the next 2 months. And then sometime this late fall, early winter, we're going to try to switch back to some in-person meetings. So I hope to see those of you who are local to the Raleigh area in person soon. Today, we're going to talk about code review and code quality, what that means, why you should care about it, and as the subtitle there says, why you should hope to code pretty one day. My name is Patrick Conley, principal software engineer at Red Hat. I've been the developer user group leader for quite a while now, and I am a MVP alum and have been working with the Salesforce community for quite a while. If you're new, welcome again. We have a North Carolina Salesforce user group Discord server that we'd love to have you in if you're in North Carolina. And we're trying to grow this community to make it a little bit easier to meet up with other folks that are local to us. So if you can join, we'd love to have you. And I'll put this back up towards the end if you don't get a chance to write it down now. So let's talk about what a code review is and why you should care about it. Roughly, a code review is a way to have other people look over code that you or someone else has written and to view it in a consistent way to help reduce issues. These issues stem from a lot, and we're going to kind of cover some of the issues that you should be covering in your code reviews. But the first step for this is if you don't already do code reviews, and even if you do, you probably should review this, is to set clear goals and expectations. You should, as a team, have defined what you're trying to get out of your code reviews and what the expectations of everybody involved is. That should be what, if you are a senior developer or a junior developer, somebody in that gamut, know what you are supposed to be doing as part of their code review, know when you're supposed to do it, get ideas around what the expected turnaround time for code reviews are, things of that nature, and make sure everybody is on the same field and everybody understands what their role in the code review process. Make sure that you include everyone in the process. If you are brand new, you can definitely benefit from having your code reviewed. But if you're also experienced and have been writing stuff on the platform forever, you can also benefit from having your code reviewed. As a perfect example, I honestly did not plan this, but yesterday morning, I sent out a code review to one of my other senior devs for what I thought was just going to be a quick rubber stamp change. It was literally a one-line change. And he caught a problem with the review that would have made our build process fail because I should have been a 2-line change instead of a 1-line. And so by doing code review instead of me just pushing it out, it's an example of a way that you can catch these types of issues early and stop breaking builds, stop from hopefully pushing bugs or logical errors out to production. And one of the most important things is be positive. Everybody learns differently. Everybody has different parts of their professional growth, and being positive and helping to explain why you're asking people to make changes or explain and don't put down like, oh, you're dumb for doing this. You should have done it this way. Say, this is not the right way to do it. You should have done it this way because of this. Or I think that it would be better to do it this way. Put that kind of positive spin. Don't put people down because you're less likely to have issues and people are more likely to want to participate in code reviews if it is a positive experience. So your code reviews should include these 5 things. You should be looking for readability, security, specifically for Salesforce, but in general, test coverage, architecture-related things, and reusability. So what do I mean by readability? This means that across your entire code base, you want consistency. There is no wrong or right way to name things. There are industry best practices. There are Salesforce suggested things like naming triggers a certain way, naming classes and helpers a certain way. But there is no wrong or a right way. And anybody who tells you that this is you're wrong if you don't name your variables this specific way, that's not what matters. What matters is consistency. Find something that is works for your team and be consistent in the variable and method naming norms. Some of this will be covered by some automation that we'll talk about later, but consistency is key throughout all of this. Also help with legibility. You can make some really abstract variable names. Like I can name everything I want in my classes one letter, and that is perfectly fine. But Salesforce doesn't care if you have 16 character long variable names. Use them, make your code more readable and legible, and that will help. And that's something that in the part of the code review process you should be thinking about of, does what's in the code make sense and is legible and consistent? And then also check for misspelling and typos. You're going to run across them. It's easier to catch them now than once they've gotten to production, or you've got to change 17 times that a method has been called after it's been deployed because people were just copy and pasting or using the autofill function and didn't realize you had a typo in your method name. Security. This is probably one of the hardest things for new people to kind of contribute, because if you're not used to some of the security reasoning behind why it's going on, this one can be tough, but especially as a senior person reviewing code, this should be one of the top of mind things. And this includes reviewing possible exploits. This could be things like SOQL injection, or unhandled user input, privacy and sharing issues. You should be committing all of your stuff to your version control and deployment process, and that includes permission sets and profiles. So part of your review process should be reviewing those permission sets and profiles and making sure that if they are adding a new field as part of this work, that the sharing rules are correct and that the visibility is correct and that you're not oversharing. Same thing with the sharing rules for your Apex classes and things, and make sure those are set correctly. Compliance issues. Depending on what environment you're working in, you may have to comply with HIPAA or other various compliances, and that is something you also need to keep in mind. Does your personally identifiable information, should that be exposed to every profile? Probably not. Making sure that it's set to the right people, or at least set to the right permission set. And then availability issues. This one's kind of nebulous, but if you think of it as a way that somebody could, do some kind of exploit against you to bring down your community site, your API, flood your endpoint with a bunch of useless data and cause your support reps to now have to weed through thousands of spam cases to actually find real customer cases. These types of things are a security concern, and is something that a code review can help at least call forth, or at least make people aware of. Now, not all of the issues that you come up with in a code review are going to be things that need to be fixed right away as part of that code review. It is also more than okay to say, this specific issue, we're okay with the threat level, if you will, or the possible outcomes of it, and file an issue to then fix later, either as part of an upcoming release or something else later down the road. But having that recorded somewhere is important. Then test coverage. One of the things that Salesforce does great, and is one of my favorite things about the platform, is that it does require you to write tests. One of the things that the platform doesn't do great is that it doesn't care what kind of test you write, as long as you actually have coverage. This is where tests or code reviews come into place. As a reviewer, you should be looking over the tests and making sure that they actually are testing things. Make sure that you're inserting your data, calling your methods, and actually getting back data you expect not just calling them and not doing asserts and checks. And then actually making sure that you have the right types of tests, not just your positive tests, but your negative tests, your bulk tests. These things are important both for security as well as for making sure that you don't run into any bugs. But it's very easy to just want to write the fewest amount of tests and get it done with. But by doing these code reviews, we can make sure that we're actually writing the right types of tests. And then again, like security, this is one of those ones that if you're new to the platform might be harder, but best practices. Making sure that you're not putting all of your code into triggers, but to putting them into classes, to using factories if you're ready for that type of work. SOQL query optimization, making sure that you're using indexed fields correctly. You're not using like where you don't need to be using like. Those types of architectural best practices were great for reviewing in code. And again, making sure that you're going to deliver the best product you can. What is a code review not for? I've talked a lot about what you should use them for, but a code review is not a time to review formatting. That should be done before the code review is ever sent. It's not about how many tabs and spaces you have in places. It's not about whether you've got spaces around equal signs, or your class name doesn't follow the right camel spacing, or you have underscores in the class name where you shouldn't. That type of thing should be done long before. And that should be done as part of our code cleanliness on automation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And lastly, who should participate in code reviews? Everyone. And I literally mean everyone. Everybody that wants to should be able to. If you've got a business analyst that's thinking about becoming a developer or wants to see what you're doing, invite them to a code review. Even if they don't feel like they're going to contribute, even if they don't put a single comment on a code review, if they're reviewing the code, looking over it, it's a great way to learn. And it's a great way to also try to see what's happening in the code and making sure that it's following the business rules that they may have asked for. If you're a new person to code reviews and you're one of these people that are learning as you're reviewing the code, ask questions. It's, code reviews don't necessarily have to be, oh, I see this problem on this line. They can also be, hey, I see you're doing this function here. Can you explain to me why you're doing that? And that's, it's a great way to, review and learn. And I just realized that based on this list here, I actually skipped one. This is what you get. We're not reviewing your slides before. Reusability. There are going to be some of the tools that we talk about later that talk about duplicate code, but reusability is something that you should keep in mind while doing your code review to make sure that you are reusing code. If you have same lines over and over again, put it into a new method and call that method. Try to reduce the amount of duplicate code, because if you do that, then you reduce the chance that if you have to make a change to it, you forget a place by using that reusability. And that's something you should strive for with your code reviews. I'm going to take a pause here before we get on to the code cleanliness and tooling. Do we have any questions? You can feel free to either ask them in the Q&A tab or unmute yourself and ask. Okay, I will take silence as everybody's either asleep or as I'm doing such a great job that nobody's got any problems or any questions. So let's talk tooling. I didn't write a slide about this because it's pretty vague and it's going to depend a lot on your organization. But tooling for code reviews specifically, there are lots of options. If you're pushing to GitHub, you can always just use GitHub merge requests. Same with GitLabs with the pull requests. There are tooling around a tool called Garrett that we use at Red Hat for some of our code reviews, which is not tied specifically to any Git repo. But the important part about these is that they allow you to give feedback on the code directly on the code. So one of the things that I've seen people do before is just, write it into a Google Doc or send it in an email with line numbers. The problem with that is you do a rebase, you make a change, you lose that tracking of where the code was, where the actual action items are. By having them in a system like Garrett or GitHub or GitLab, you actually have actionable items on the site that talk where at in the code the issue is. You can have a discussion on that. You can either mark it as resolved and done, or you can, ignore that and say, I don't want to do this because of this reason, or answer questions as to I'm doing this because, and it's all tracked right there. And that also leads to later down the line, if you like, why did we decide this? You can go back and look at that code review, and maybe there'll be some instances in that code review as to why those decisions were made. So code quality is another thing that I have a lot of opinions on. But the biggest thing is, like I said before, is consistency. By using tools to apply code quality, you have consistency. If everybody's using the same tool, the same rule set, the code will look the same. It may not appease everybody, and quite honestly, it probably never will, because you could write books on people arguing about tabs versus spaces, but consistency is what matters. Code quality tools also enforce best practices for the most part. We'll talk about some of these tools later in just a minute, but for example, they will say, you shouldn't have code in your trigger, and you will fail those code quality checks before it ever gets pushed to code review, which is important. Because your code review, if you're focusing on consistency of variable naming and spaces and trailing white space, and the fact that they put things in a trigger or a DML operation in a loop, if you're focusing on that as part of the code review, you're not going to be working on improving the code and improving your code standards, because you're just going to be looking for those quality issues that, quite honestly, a computer is better at looking at. These also provide real-time feedback. Most of the ones we talk about have VS Code plugins or can be run from the command line, and will provide real-time feedback on the file, so you'll know instantly, oh, look, I did a DML in a loop here and I shouldn't do that. And then also you can, if you should do that, like there are some cases where you have to do it in a loop or you want to, it will require you to put a comment in the code to say why you did that. And that also then makes it easier for folks to come back later and see. So the 4 tools I'm going to talk about are PMD, SonarQube, ESLint, and StyleLint. There are going to be probably lots of other tools out there. And once we're done talking, if you have a favorite that you want to talk about or enlighten us on, we'll gladly talk about it. But I'm going to talk about these 4 to start with. PMD is a real-time local static analysis based on a set of rule sets for both best practices, and you can write your own custom rules. It runs on Apex in Java, and lots of other different languages. And it allows us to, again, see what problems exist in our code in real time. I unfortunately don't have it set up on this laptop that I've got, so I can't really demo it for you. And honestly, it's just a bunch of squiggly lines in Visual Studio, so it's not, super great demo. But it does allow that real-time feedback. And you can customize those rules that if your team says, all variables must, all non-static variables must start with lowercase and all static variables must have all uppercase, You can set that in the rule, and you can enforce that before it ever hits code review. SonarQube is a hosted extension of PMD with a bunch of extra features. You can store code coverage and test runtimes. You can assign issues that SonarQube flags to users. You can do lots of stuff. Now, you may ask, why would I want to use PMD and SonarQube? The reason is belt and suspenders, pretty much. SonarQube allows you to take the entire code base and run it through, while most of the time PMD, you're going to be running it just on the code that you're working on. You might have a pre-commit hook or workflow in GitHub or GitLab that runs PMD on everything before, but it's always nice to have that extra set of results. You also may, if you're in an older code org like we are, we have very specific PMD rules that we try to follow that are applicable to everything that we have written. And then we have SonarQube, which has got extra stuff in it that covers things that we didn't have time to fix before implementing PMD. So SonarQube acts as kind of our backlog of things to fix. None of those are like high security issues. Those are all covered in our current PMD. But things like this variable is unused, this method name is too long, those types of things, which are called code smells in SonarQube, we can then go back in hardening sprints and clean up that code. Also, you can take the code results, the test results from Salesforce, as well as the test runtime, and stick it into SonarQube and see where your test coverage is lacking. And it'll show you with percentages next to all the lines or all the classes in red and green lines to say this line is covered, this one is not, and this test took this amount of time to run. And it's a very nice way to condense all of your code quality into a single location. I don't know if there are web hosted versions of this. We have used some local hosting. It's pretty easy to spin up either on a standard Linux box or in a Docker container. It's pretty well documented, and the community version is free and open sourced. And then lastly, I lumped ESLint and StyleLint together because they're static analysis tools for non-Apex related things. Now with Salesforce Lightning and Lightning components, you're going to spend a lot of time writing JavaScript and CSS, and those are not things that you should ignore. Again, you should have style rules for your organization, for your JavaScript, and for your CSS, and then pretty much anything else you got. If you're using TypeScript to compile down into JS, use, I think ESLint does TypeScript as well, but use a linter. Any project that I spin up, I find a linter for it. I've got YAML linters, I've got markdown linters. Everything is linted and everything is consistent. Do I like the way that everything of it is written? No. There's one of the markdown linters says this is the best practice to do a certain number of spaces before list items, and it drives me crazy, but it's consistent. And if it's my own code and it drives me crazy, I'm sure that in a large org, somebody else is going to be driven crazy by your style rules, but consistency is the biggest thing. So let's revisit any questions on tooling anybody has. Okay. Anybody got a tool that I missed that I should include or want to tell the rest of the class about?
We use Visual Studio Code with a couple of Apex and Salesforce plugins.
Yeah, and again, that's pretty common. Using there's a Salesforce style checker that uses PMD under the hood, as well as you can just use the straight up PMD for VS Code. But again, the biggest thing is consistency. Keep your configurations with your code base so that everybody has the same setup. If you're using VS Code, I do recommend that you look at the extensions. There's like an extensions directory where you can put recommended extensions in it. And that way, if you have a new developer come on, they can load VS Code for the first time, and VS Code will be like, you should install these extensions. And again, that way everybody's using the same stuff instead of trying to pick their favorite ESLint checker or their favorite CSS checker.
Patrick, this is Ram. I'm from India.
Yep.
So I want to check, like, when you do a code review, like what kind of suggestions you give, or anyone in this meeting, where you'll give your suggestions to your colleagues about designing a component which can be reused. So that's what that can be one of the outcomes of your code review, right? You can look at a piece of code which can be reused in multiple places. It could be a component, or it could be a small piece of Apex code or something.
Yeah, that's pretty common. Typically, if I see something being done more than once, whether that's assigning the same variable or the same, doing the same set of things more than once, I ask to have them remove it into its own method. We do that a lot with our test setup and stuff. And so that's where we get a lot of that reuse. But just saying, I see you do this multiple times, I think that should be, condensed into a single reusable, method, function, variable, whatever. And I would say that I just lost my train of thought there.
Actually, in Apex, yep, you can easily bring it up. But when I speak about maybe a Lightning Web component, when I'm doing a code review on Lightning Web component, so how do you see that? Okay, this piece of logic can be created as a generic component and can be used maybe across the org itself, not just for the developer who is using it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I would just say is that that's, if you've got that, then say that I think that this should be, its own component or moved into a utility method that the components are using. And it's, it's going to depend on your design and how you deploy and how you package things. But again, just bringing that up as part of the code review, and saying that this is something that should be reused. And again, if they don't use it right away, at least file an issue somewhere to say refactor this down the line. If it's something that's like has to be done right away, you can always come back and refactor it later. Just don't say, oh yeah, I'll get back to it, and don't file something because you won't.
Okay. Thanks, Patrick.
Patrick, do you address comments or lack thereof, or too many comments in code?
Absolutely. And that's a kind of a touchy subject. There are lots of people who, in my opinion, are over commenters. I had a conversation with one of my developers this morning about this exact thing, so it's very apropos. If the comment adds something to the code, definitely put it in. If you see a line that has a high complexity, right? Like if you can't break it up, or they don't want to break it up, say you at least need a comment here telling me in 3 weeks what this does, because I will not remember it if I have to come back to this. We, as part of our style requirements and part of our static analysis, we require Java doc essentially for all of the methods, JavaScript documentation for all the functions in JavaScript. Everything has to have all of the correct documentation there. That also helps when you're using VS Code to have everything look up and have all that documentation there. But it also helps in the long term. And if you're using small enough chunks of code, small enough methods, then that documentation for the actual individual methods tends to be enough. Okay. So like I said, I'll put this back up for folks if they want to see that. If you have any questions and you didn't want to ask it in a public forum, you can feel free to join the Discord there and message me directly or ask it in the chat. You can also find me on Twitter, and I will pull that up in just a second with that if you have anything there. Otherwise, I think that'll wrap it up for us. And we'll see you guys in a couple of months with our next speaker.
Thank you.